All right. Thanks for joining again today, guys. We're going to go over the Azure pricing calculator and talk about all the nice things that Azure has to offer um, in the pricing calculator to help you build your Azure practice. I'm TJ Turner, one of the DSEs here at TD Synnex on the Azure side specifically. If you've spoken with me, hi again. If you have not, I am one of those resources that your sales rep can reach out to and pull me into calls to help you get started on your Azure journey. If we take a look here, and we can see that there's lots and lots of things at Azure, and so we understand that it can be very overwhelming as to where do you get started in building and having customers that say, hey, I want to start my journey to Azure and move my off-prem infrastructure into the Azure cloud. And what are your options? And then it's like, where do you start? So a lot of people will start just with the basic, what I have today, and I'll move it into Azure, which is a great place to start. But we also know how much does that cost? We need to know what that is. And so there's lots of pieces why I kind of show this periodic table of Azure, that there's lots of pieces that kind of go into it, but not all of them all at the same time. And that's the beauty that you have with Azure, as you all have probably heard. You have things at your disposal like cost management and Azure Migrate and Azure Backups and things of that sort to kind of start that journey to the cloud. So let's go ahead and get started with just our pricing calculator. We're going to do this demo of what you're going to see right off the bat, and then we'll kind of step through all the little elements that you have in the pricing calculator and then kind of do a little run through of a quick estimate. Now, I do want to say it is an estimate on purpose because Azure is a consumption-based model. And so what we do in Azure is always build after we've used it. So when we're pricing out in the calculator, we don't have a consistent month. So we have 31-day months and we have 30-day months. And we'll kind of go over how that's calculated in the calculator to allow for that. So if you just give me a minute and I'll get over to the calculator. So this is the first thing that you'll see when you go to the pricing calculator. It is a public domain or a public tool for your ability. I like to log in because it gives me a lot of extra features throughout the calculator. One of them is saved estimates. You can kind of see that I have a bunch of saved estimates that I've worked on that either wasn't ready to go or wanted me to keep or something of that sort that will that I need to keep around. Either I like to use it as a template or I want to they know that's the long tail kind of a sales pitch. So they're going to need it in a couple of months. And the way that the bottom here where I have estimates is I can have a bunch of estimates open at the same time. However, I'm only allowed so many. And so after about a month or so of building out estimates for partners and you all, I end up running out of needing to get rid of some of these estimates that I have open. And the best way to some that I know I might need to reference again is I'll save them here, just a quick little save, call the estimate what I want to, and it's saved in my saved estimates. So for this one, it's like demo company ABC, and I usually like to put the date on there. In this case, I'll do today's date. Oops. And I will save that. And that will be in my saved estimates. And this is a great way to kind of either build out some of your common scenarios or even customers who say, oh, I'm not ready yet, but talk to me in a couple of months. Okay, these are great ways that you don't lose those pieces, those estimates that you've built in the calculator. The logging in also gives you that ability that it saves this here. But one other thing is this little share button. And what this share button does is you can see here, it generates a unique link from the pricing calculator for the estimate that we built. I can share this with, say you want to work with us at Synex to say, hey, did I do this right? Or am I missing something? Or can you double check my work? As you're getting into this, there's a lot to cover on the pricing calculator. So this session is being recorded, so we're going to throw a lot of information at you today. So don't be afraid, but this will allow you to send this to us, and we can set up a meeting and talk about it, and maybe even throw it back to you before. Oh, this looks great. You just forgot the line for backup or something of a line item that we like to usually include for Azure backup. Oh, okay, great. And then you can go on your merry way. And this can also be sent to your end customer as well, as everything done in the pricing calculator is MSRP. So these prices are not partner discounts and not what your margins are with Synex. These are MSRP prices. That does not mean that you have to price this or send the bill if it comes in. Nothing that I have ever seen from an estimate is ever exactly what the estimate says at the end of the month, but does not mean that you have to send the MSRP to your customer. It is at your discretion and however your contracts are laid out as to how you want to bill your end user. So with that, we'll kind of go back to the overall layout here of the pricing calculator. The first thing here is just kind of what's popular, what's normally used, and it's in the Microsoft way. Haha, Kubernetes is this very popular thing. Obviously, they've kind of selected what those things are. And so we do use virtual machines and storage accounts very frequently, sometimes even Azure SQL databases as we build these estimates out. So once we do that, if we click on one of them, and I'll kind of create a new one here just by clicking this blue button, it will add, and you can kind of see here on the right-hand side, the virtual machine was added, and I can click this view button, and it'll scroll me right down to the line item that was added. So with that, I now have a virtual machine. I can call this virtual machine what I would like to. So if I have server 1, I can give it a name here so I don't get confused, because as we all know that we a lot of times have more than one server within the infrastructure. So it leaves me a server 1. I can collapse this also so that everything kind of gets consolidated and I can see everything at one time. And I can do that overall collapse, and I'll show you that once we add more line items and some of these other features that are available up here as well. Next, I want to talk about region. And this is consistent throughout anything that we add within Azure. And Azure is important to know region because Microsoft prices things based on regions that you're expected to use. So their cost of those data centers have a standard, number, and Microsoft then turns that cost and what those features are, and what, in this case, what instance series of VMs are available in that region. Not everything is available in every region. So this is why it's important to know the region. Well, how do I know what I want to pick? Well, this is where at the end of our session today, this will be in your resource links, but we can see the global infrastructure that Microsoft has. It's very large, it's very vast. And just a few months ago, they just brought online the West US 3, which I think is more in Arizona. They're building a East US 3, which I think they're expected to come online very, very soon in the Georgia region. So we can kind of tell where the data centers are, or those regions are set, including even the things that are in Asia and Europe and Australia and things of that sort. If your customers are there, this is a great way of pushing your applications, pushing your products to as close to the customer as possible. Obviously, considering data sovereignty things and the like, but those are ways of getting your stuff as close to the customer as possible. So this is how we decide. I typically, when I'm building out an estimate, unless somebody tells me, I'm usually picking the East US 2 region. One, it's closest to me, and two, it's one of the newer data centers that has most of the newer features that are available. That also gives me, if I remember correctly, let's see if I can go back. They also have a nice little map on the global infrastructure page that kind of gives you the globe view that you can kind of take a look at. And their nice little intro of how the global infrastructure is kind of built out. They usually, let's see if I can go, if we choose the right region, is very important because this gives you what products are available in these regions. So let's see, East US 2, we can see products that are available in this region. So these pages are very important as we go through to know how to build out these infrastructures. And you may not need to reference these because it may be a very basic infrastructure, and that's fine. I want to give you all the information as possible as you start to your journey and getting your customers to the cloud. So I'll use East US 2 for our demo here and server 1. So I'm going to kind of pick the D series servers are general servers. Well, how do I know that? Well, again, we have documentation here about VMs. So there's this little info icon gives us pricing details, product details, and documentation. I've already opened up the documentation for virtual machine sizes, right? There's a lot more other than with instances and a lot of other virtual machine documentation here, but this is the most used page. What size and what's the features of those instance series and that I might need. Do I need memory optimized? Do I need GPUs? Do I need high performance? Usually we go into general purpose. And so in the general purpose, this kind of explains here as to like this DDV4, the DDSV4 runs on an Intel 8272CL Cascade Lake processors. And it kind of gives us all the features that are in those versions of those instance types. Now, I do want to talk while I'm here, and I'll kind of show you the difference between them, but I do want to talk about these B series machines. So a lot of us have customers who have domain controllers or lightly used web servers or SFTP servers or services that need to be up all the time, but don't really need a lot of compute capacity all the time as that server is running. So these B series and is called the burstable workloads, and it's designed so that you can have a full server up and available 24/7, but don't have to. Essentially, you're kind of sharing this workload or sharing this server with others. But what you have, and we standard, like we typically will pick this B2MS. And this 60% number means, okay, how do you get the 200%? Let's start there. The max CPU is there's two processors. Each processor is 100%, and so you get the 200%. So what they calculate then off of that is you can stay under 60% and you can start building credit. Start building what's kind of like a bank. You're building up hours that you can use against bursting above that 60% number. So if your overall CPU usage of a machine goes to 65%, you need to have a bank, you need to have time in that bank to be able to go above that 65%. Otherwise, you will sit at that 60%. You will be throttled at 60%. Now, some workloads work fine, and if nobody knows, there's a throttling going on. Like domain controllers typically don't ever go above that 60%, but we have to have them on all the time. SFTP servers, a lot of the times it's the evening time where they're getting the big workloads to come through, but you need to have it available all the time. This is a great way of being able to have a cost-effective solution in Azure without having to pay a full server price in the D series. And so what I'll kind of show you here with that is we can see this D2 V3, which is a 2 CPU, 8 gigs of RAM, is 18 cents an hour. Now, if I go into, and we can see that there is a lot of options to select from, so don't get scared by the list. We can filter those things out by category and instance series. I just kind of know how the list typically is. But that B2MS that I have here, we can see that it's 9 cents an hour. So this costs $66 versus that D2, which was 188, if I remember correctly. Let me go back down there and grab that. Way down on the list. D2. Did I pass it? I probably passed it already. Let's see here. Yeah, this is fine because this is the same machine, and I'll cover this in just a second. Yeah, so it's 137 versus the 66 that B series is. Now, what I like to say with that is sometimes it's best to price out or estimate out or put in the calculator the D series comparable to that B series machine. And what that can give you, if it's at low level domain controller and you have one of them, it gives you some padding on the estimate so that a lot of times end users, they look at that price and they're like, okay, that's what we're going to be. Some months they're over that, some months they're under that, and that can sometimes be a sticking point for some end customers. So we want to give you the tools to kind of help build out what it looks like, but also give you some wiggle room in the estimate so that if you are giving them the MSRP price, you're not having to fight with the end user on that, what that cost is fluctuating from month to month. And that's really important to kind of, I'm going to reiterate that again here, is that this is an estimate. This isn't an actual cost. And month to month is going to change. Just because we have 31 days, we have 30 days, then we have February, it's got 28 or 29, depending on, leap year or not. But also, there's other things that go into a subscription. There's network costs, there's storage transaction costs, there's little things that kind of sometimes add up and are different usage from month to month that go along with it. So we don't want you to be surprised. We want to be as transparent as possible to you so that you have all the tools and information at your disposal to be able to present the correct solution for your end customer. One other thing about instance types that I want to hit on is you see this S that's here, and the S, and we'll see if I can find that that D2 V3 without the S real quick, because we'll see those are all of the sorting through the list, as you can see, can be a little cumbersome, but okay, those are, and you can kind of see how it's a little bit different. So the S in this, in like the V2s is the DS2 V2, whereas this is the D2S V3. So Microsoft isn't always consistent with their naming of series. And I wish they would be. Here it is. But you can see like this D2 here, if I can get this D2 V3 and this D2S V3, they are the same price. They're the same cost per hour. The only difference between these two is the availability of storage and what storage options you have to you. So S in these cases stands for storage, and that is consistent across all series of machines here in Azure. So I'm going to select the S because I'll come down here to the manage disk section of the virtual machine, and I'll show you that what would be available to you with the non-S version of this machine would just be the standard HDD and the standard SSD. And that's fine if that's all you're expecting to use. These these two options do not have SLAs behind them, and there are storage transactions that go along with that. So that's where some of the fluctuation comes in. They are cheaper disks, obviously the standard, and you can build out redundancy if you see fit. Like a 128 gig disk is just under $10. You're going to pay for all 128 for anything that is attached, and I'll talk about this under the storage side when we add one of those storage accounts. But we will pay for 128 gigs of that disk because it's a virtual machine disk, so it's attached to the VM and is basically allocated 100% to your usage for that VM. There's storage transaction costs, but you can see that it's not very expensive. But I just want to be transparent and let you know that they are there, and there is that there is a cost associated with some of those transactions. So you would see a line item on the on your bill that would associate with storage transactions. Now, if I move into the premium SSD, you'll see that storage transactions drops off. I still have the ability to do redundancy, and then I can pick, again, that 128 gig disk. That's a standard image that kind of comes out of Azure when you're building things from the Azure images. But you can see that it's $17.92. The premium SSD has SLAs behind it. Microsoft will get its best effort to and work and can do will actually give you the credits if they miss their SLAs on their premium SSDs. Again, past performance does not guarantee future results, and Microsoft has yet to lose any disks, as I'm aware of. But these are just kind of things to keep in mind as we are building out this environment. So in this case, I'm going to kind of keep this at 100, the server here. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we go on to some other things, and then we'll come back and talk about these options down here on savings. Is that obviously the couple of things here is that you can select Windows or Linux, and obviously Linux, you remove that OS option. And obviously that does affect, that will change the overall monthly price. The number of hours that we use a month, the 730 hours that we use, that's basically calculated over 30 or the 365 days divided by 24, 365 times 24 divided by 12, and that gives us that 730. So it's basically an average of how many hours are a month. So there's no month that has 730 hours. The 31-day months, I think it's 742. And the 30-day months, I think it's 726, something in that ballpark, if I remember off the top of my head. So you can pad in here as well. If you wanted to say, I wanted to do 742 hours, it definitely changes that price because this is calculated based on the hours. Now, this is also a great way of showing some savings in that, I'm only going to run this during the work week. Well, that may be only 300 hours. Well, we looked at, that was originally a 137, right? $155 machine, and now running it at 300 hours, it drops it to $74.32, right, on the estimate. So shutting a machine down does save you money, and can save if you want to do that. And there are tools and automations in Azure to be able to help with that. And so hours do matter, obviously, in the calculation that we kind of build out here. Excuse me. So we'll leave this for, but how we get to that number is basically, 365 times 24 divided by 12 gets us that 730 hours that we use throughout as we build out our estimates. As you go along, you will get better and you'll get more familiar with this. And VMs is one of those very common things that we estimate out a lot. So I'll collapse this one. And I'll kind of come back up here and I'll add a storage account. Again, I can do this, or I can kind of slide back down and see here. Again, I have to select my region. Something to keep in mind too, with the pricing calculator, what is in the pricing calculator is not everything you configure within that infrastructure. So there's no network configuration or anything of that sort here in the calculator, but there is in Azure. I mean, I think that's kind of obvious because how else are you going to communicate? But networking does not have a cost except for when you leave the VLAN. So anything going into Azure, there's no cost, network wise. Anything that leaves, kind of the way we say it, is anything that leaves Azure, there is a cost. So that cost is not, the networking is not in here. It's under the virtual machine. There's a bandwidth item that you can say, oh, you get 5 gigs free. But if anything that leaves, if oh, this is a high transaction that really there's a lot of data that leaves, then you can dial that in here. We like to say internet egress going out of the East US 2 region, and I can dial in, say, I know that there's 100 gigs that leaves, right? Now, it's not a very big cost, but again, it's being transparent and being clear as to where the numbers, kind of what makes up all these numbers. But bandwidth is, there's a line item here. It doesn't you don't configure what your network looks like. So sometimes it can be confusing. It was confusing by me when I first got started doing this. This is my configuration. Well, these are all the things that dial into cost. So not everything is available here because it doesn't affect the cost. Same with storage accounts, right? I can pick what type of storage accounts I have. So there's a difference when we pick storage accounts, right? I'm picking the region, and region does affect price. I'll slide up here to the VM again as I go back and forth a little bit. I apologize. But Central US. So I'm at $163 for this D2S V3. In the Central US, it's $182. So we can see the difference in data centers and regions as to where I want the machines. And that's something to keep in mind as you're building out infrastructure and making decisions as to where to deploy these resources, because maybe you want them in the East region because it's more cost effective to be in the East region. You're definitely getting high bandwidth and as low latency as possible. But again, if you're out in Montana trying to reach the East region, there could be latency that would be a lot less if you were in that central region, let's say. But I did want to show how region can affect the price and why it's important when selecting the region for costing. Now, as we go back down to storage accounts, I'm going to talk about kind of the types a little bit and give a general overview. I think we have a video in some of our repositories that allow that one of my cohorts, David Bloom, did, and goes into deeper explanations as to all the storage types and how it's used and how you benefit from it and which one you should use and which architecture type. Block blob storage is going to be an application only access. So that means, like, if you're using backup software, say Veeam or Carbonite or something of that sort, they can leverage Azure block blob storage here as their backup destination for all of their for all of the data that they're going to back up. This is important because you're not going to pay for, in this case, it's got a terabyte. If I have 2 terabytes that I need, but I'm not going to use all 2 terabytes of that right away, I'm not going to pay for 2 terabytes. It's going to be what I'm going to pay for what I use. So in the estimate, it's really good to know how much data you're really using and then give it a little bit of a padding as you know your growth rate. And so there are transaction costs associated with that, and you can kind of see, write operations are a little bit more than, list, create, and read operations on that storage. So these are all things that kind of get dialed in. when we talk about block blob storage. It is an API access only storage. It is not like your typical SMB share that you have as a file server. That would be our file storage. So that's a little bit different, right? And you have let's say 2 terabytes there with a 1 terabyte snapshot, right? Maybe your snapshot's a little bit smaller, 500 gigs, right? You're gonna have to pay for all of that storage. Now, what you're using is what you're going to pay for. Again, with file storage, just because you may have provisioned or you've given yourself space of 2 terabytes, you don't necessarily, we all know how file servers kind of work. We don't like to get all the way up to our full capacity. We know that's the same thing in the VMs, but we have to dedicate all of that on the VM side. Therefore, that's why that disk, you're going to pay for 100% of that disk. So in this case, we have 2 terabytes, transactions, operations here, have some transactions. The only thing about the file servers is that you can have a sync server. So sync servers, you get one sync server built into this overall cost. And what this does is basically allows you to have a server on-prem that synchronizes to your Azure files to kind of help eliminate kind of keep things as close and keep things as quickly accessible to your end customers, to the users that may need that. And this is just asking for an additional. So if you needed 2 of them, then we would put 1 here for an additional $5. So again, these are all the things that kind of weigh into cost. And you can kind of see as we change from block blob as to these options all changed versus file storage. And so next, we don't really use table, queue, or data lake unless you're doing some major thing. Page blobs used to be how VMs had disks, but now we've moved into the managed disk. So if you want to add, say, a SQL server, I want to have a managed disk where I give an OS disk of 128 gigs, but I need a 2 terabyte disk for SQL Server. And this is also a way that you can give differing performant disks. So this case, this is a standard HDD. I want to give it a premium SSD, right? Because I know this is SQL and I know that it needs access to that disk, heavily. So I'm going to give it the 2 terabytes that I'm asking for. So that's a $235 disk, right? I'm going to pay for all 2 terabytes. Now, this is where I talk about when it comes to right sizing as well. And I kind of will, refer back to the VMs. A lot of times we have a 4 CPU box with 16 gigs of memory, maybe at an on-premise infrastructure, because we really don't want to have to rebuild or add to a machine, and it takes a lot of time and it's a lot of effort to make sure everything works and gets into the VM as we expect. It's a little more involved. Where in Azure, you don't have to do that. And this is where it's really important too to talk about right sizing is, do you really need a machine that has 4 CPUs now, or can you do it as 2 CPUs and in a year or 2 years or 3 years grow into that 4 CPU box? That will save on cost, and you can easily flip in the Azure portal. There's a little option on the side when you're in the VM itself, and it says size. You can go into size, and with a quick reboot of the machine, it'll resize to that new 4 CPU box with no hassle at all to move into that. So I mentioned all of that because right sizing on storage does matter too, in the sense that if you don't need all 2 terabytes and you only need 500 or you maybe less than 500 gigs today, you can grow this incrementally. And you can see that I'm, $66 versus the $235. So keeping in mind that we do understand that price is a major factor when it comes to moving things to the cloud. But these are the options that we kind of see frequently in the storage accounts. Block Blob is one of these that I will kind of refer back to, and this is a great way of moving into Azure via backup. It's kind of that first step into maybe using a hybrid approach where you can start using your backup software or even using Azure Backup to do its backup into Azure, where you can then recover in Azure if there was an issue as well. Even using Azure Site Recovery, which is a different product that Azure has to make sure that all things stay consistent and you can spin up very quickly and very easily in Azure with a configuration ready to go if there was an issue with your on-premise data center. So what I can do here too is if I need another VM, I can use this little clone button here. So if I don't like the storage account, I can trash it just as easily. But if I need another VM, everything that's kind of configured in this VM, I can, and if it's the same, I can do one of two things. I can clone, or I can add another virtual machine here. And that's just going to basically double my cost, right? So 163.47 doubles to 371. If they're exactly the same, and knowing that it's server one, I could say server one, and two, if I wanted to. But I'm going to back this off. I'm going to say domain controller, v1 here. And what I'll do is then I will clone this line item. Now I'll come in here because it's not a domain controller. I want to call this SQL. So I wanted to show SQL here under the virtual machine side because I didn't talk about type when we were talking about virtual machines. This is where I can add SQL as an option. Now, defaultly, Microsoft likes to say you should be in SQL Enterprise. Most often, that's not the case. So we can change our license type to standard, and it will include the SQL licensing in your system cost. And you will see as we go up in CPU counts, like there's a 4 CPU. Now we go to 8 CPU, we can see that the licensing cost does change based on the CPUs that we use. So this is very important. And one of the things when you're selecting SQL, which is why we will often go down to these E-level machines, one, because they're higher memory, lower CPU count, but you can also see that like there's this 128 gigs of memory, but this E16. So an E16 usually, these are the AS servers, which I think are AMD. So let me see if I can find the, yeah. So these DS are Intel based, but we can see like this E16 gives me 8 CPUs or there's 16 CPUs. Now, they all are different because I'm presenting 4 CPUs as opposed to all 16 CPUs. So I may not need 16 CPUs. I need higher memory. So that's where these E-series machines really come into play, and we can say, oh, I need this high memory usage. Most cases, what we've seen is only occasionally have we seen somebody needing like these 32s or 48 core virtual CPU boxes. So I'll kind of go down here to this the E8 4DS and show that, oh, my licensing cost is now a 4 CPU licensing cost for SQL standard. And so now I have my SQL server. Now I have that managed disk that I had, which is 128 gigs, and I need to have a couple more. And the pricing calculator likes to log me out occasionally. So I'll add this storage account underneath the SQL server here. And I'll put that managed disk and say, I need premium and I want 512 gigs. And that's going to be my data disk. I can include, and I can add another one here, and I could call, let's say I call this SQL data. And this one will be called SQL T-logs. Because a lot of times the best practice is separating spindles to make sure that performance is not affected by either one of those functions. So I got a managed disk, premium SSD, again another 512 MIT logs. I can get by with 128 because I log ship, but I drop off to make sure that I'm not keeping too much around that I don't need. So that way I can make sure my monthly cost is not crazy, and but I have all the things that I need to run my SQL machine. Other options that we have here, obviously, we've kind of talked about going from on-premise infrastructure and moving it directly into the cloud. You can do this, obviously, too, with some resources that we have here at Cenex with our managed service team of doing the Azure migrate, and we can help you with that process. And that process will also give you some tools to be able to price and estimate out what that cost looks like based on what your usage is on the on-premise infrastructure. But if you wanted to do a one-to-one, this is one of the best ways of doing that one-to-one estimate. And then, so let's see, other services that we like to include are VPN. So one of the things in the pricing calculator that we didn't talk about right off the bat is, what if it's not here? And what if I can't find it in this big list of items? So like DevOps, okay, what's here? Oh, well, Azure DevOps, monitors, okay, containers, storage, compute. I need a VPN. So where would I find the VPN? Well, maybe it's just not worth my time and effort. So we can just type VPN, and then it will sort, or it will search as we start typing, and we can add that VPN. It will also see, I'll show this with the backup, as I can just type back, and we can see that it's not just searching the title of each card, but it's also searching within the description of the card. So Notification Hubs has back in the part of its description, so it's searching for that as well. So if you don't necessarily know, it's not only the title, it's searching description. So if you know how to search, if you know the description or know a few keywords, you can kind of look through that way as well. Now, while I'm here, I'll go ahead and add that in, and we'll talk about backup here in just a second. So the VPN gateway, again, we're going to put that 730 hours because we can't turn off a gateway. So in Azure, it's always on. It's never turned off. And the only way to get rid of it and to stop the compute charges from happening is to delete it. Now, VPNs are kind of, everybody has their way of doing it. You can use the Azure one. There's also third-party VPNs that you can pull in as well. Again, I like to use EastUS2. And what's the difference between the gateway types? Well, again, let's go back to our documentation. So what does our documentation say? The basic, we can only have 10 site-to-site VPN tunnels and a max of 128 point-to-site SSTP connections. We cannot do point-to-site with IKE-v2 or OpenVPN connections, and we only get 100 meg throughput, no BGP support, and no zone redundancy. So that's what the AZ stands for, is for zone redundancy, so we won't talk about that unless that's something that you need. And all that's doing, in the costing of that, is basically duplicating it, but you don't have to configure it twice. It's already configured for you. So it's a great way of having disaster recovery. So if you have two sites that you come into Azure with, it's a great way of making sure that you're kind of like triple built out. So you have the zone redundant here in Azure, and that way, if one of them goes out, you have the secondary one to pick up for you. The gateway one, which is what we typically will put in on the estimates. For the sake of it is, once you move from basic to gateway one, and you can move from basic to gateway one, you cannot move back to basic. In order to build basic, you kind of have to build it from scratch every time. You can't be in gateway one and move back to basic. Basic is a lot more, you can see that the basic is $26 an hour or $26 a month, whereas the Gateway 1 is 138. Now, it just depends on what your use case is, because you get 650 megs of throughput. BGP is supported. You get the point-to-point or point-to-site open VPN connections at 250, and then you can add an additional 20 site-to-site at cost of tunnels there. So 10 are included in the Gateway 1, but you can add 20 more for a total of 30 tunnels if that's something that you need. So you have a multi-site. So say that you're like a grocery store and you have 30 stores, you can add a tunnel to each one of those stores before having to either upgrade or build a new VPN tunnel, build a new VPN to get more tunnels. So that's the basic difference between all of those, other than just cost. So it's a little bit more performant, which is what we like to say. Also, it gives you some padding. And if they don't like that cost, you can say, well, okay, we can downgrade you to a basic. And Microsoft doesn't necessarily like it. They don't say it's a production level option, but we haven't had much pushback when it's come to issues with the basic VPN. They do recommend going to the Gateway 1 for production workloads. This is where I can add additional tunnels outside of the 10 that's already included. But also we need to kind of build out what our VPN traffic looks like. And you probably will know VPN traffic. And so usually I'll put 200 gigs there unless it's a low usage or a heavy used VPN tunnel. And this is just to help build out a line item that shows there is network costs going across the VPN. And that's how we configure, typically we'll price out our VPNs. On to the backup. Again, picking that. Now there's different types of backups that we can do here, right? So SQL Server on Azure VMs, we can do Azure VMs. We can even do backup our on-premise servers here to Azure. And then obviously there's the option for Azure files. So if we want to put a backup for, let's say, these two servers. That's the other thing. If I want to do that, I have a SQL Server on Azure VM, so I'm going to need to add another line item for that. So I have this one at 128 gigs, and I usually like to build out my backup policy. This is really important because this is going to determine how much storage is needed for your backup. We didn't talk about this under the storage counts, but redundancy, GRS stands for geographically redundant, meaning it's in two places. So you're going to pay double because it's being stored in two places. LRS is just locally redundant storage. It's there, but it's not geographically separate from that data center. So there's a pair that it's getting copied to and replicated to as well. The RA is a read access globally or geographically redundant storage, meaning that you can read access the storage in the other location. Typically we do LRS. And then obviously if you know that you're having, if the machine is changing a lot, then this is going to determine how much data is needing to be stored. So it calculates things differently if it's a high churn versus a moderate churn of data changing. So that's backup for, in this case, we'll just call it backup, DC backup. And I'll add another line item here. And this is the beautiful thing is I don't have to do anything with retention. Don't have to change redundancy. I just got to change SQL Server on Azure VM. So that then changes a few things that I have. It's a high churn. You might want to do GRS, maybe stay LRS. But again, average monthly, it's expecting 1,555 gigs of data to store. And so based on this retention policy, retain log backups for 15 days. In this case, we want to keep 2 years. And so that's how we can kind of do separate. You can add multiple lines of the same card. You don't have to do everything in one. I can type. There we go. And that I'll add just for kicks. I'll add another machine here. And we'll just call this like our app server. And what we'll do, and what I'll kind of talk about here is there savings options, right? I have an application server and needs, 2 CPUs, 8 gigs of RAM. We can see that it's, 18 cents an hour. Well, what is this reserved instances and OS, costs? Well, these are 2 things that we get a lot of questions on relating to, because what happens when we do reserve, well, you're looking at a 40% or a 62% discount. This is telling Microsoft, and these are just costing estimates. When you do this and execute this within Azure and Stellar, you're actually committing to Microsoft that you're going to have this machine, this instance type and this series around for whatever that duration is. And so if I'm going to do 1 year, I'm going to now pay, $41 a month for that compute, because I'm guaranteeing that, but I'm getting a discount on that, because if I'm in pay as you go, it's $70 a month, right? So I am getting that discount for the 1 year reservation. I can do that monthly, or I can do that all up front. It depends on how you'd like it. Now, with partners, one of the things that we want you to be aware of, you can also see that you can't double dip. Like, you can't turn the machine off and still get that 40% discount. You're guaranteeing Microsoft that machine is available to you 24/7, 365. And for that duration of that reserved instance, for in this case 1 year. So you can't turn it off and get an extra savings of not running a machine. If you do turn it off, it will try to move. It'll try to move the reservation to another machine that might be in that same series. The way reservations work is you have to be in the series and in the same region. And say if I have a 4 CPU box and I bought a 2 CPU reservation, it can cover 2 of the CPUs of a 4 CPU box. So in the case, if you turn this machine off, it will attach to that 4 CPU box, as long as it's a DSV3 series machine. Reservations also, you lose a little bit of margin from Synex. Now, there is some incentives on doing reservations. As one, you can kind of see the front end cost is a little bit lower. Your margin does change, and we can talk to your account rep about that. But Microsoft does have some incentives right now, back-end incentives, to help move people into reserved instances so that you don't really lose any of your margin. Lastly, I want to talk about OS, and this kind of applies to SQL as well. So the hybrid benefit, in order to be able to take advantage of the hybrid benefit, you have to have a non-OEM Windows license that has software assurance active and up to date. Same thing with SQL. If you have software assurance active on those licenses, you can take advantage of the hybrid benefit. And the way that hybrid benefit works is for those data center licenses. I think you can, and those standard server licenses, you can take advantage of a couple of machines. Like the standard gives you, I think, the ability to do 2 machines in Azure, up to 16 CPUs. Whereas data center allows you to go, I think, for as many cores as you've bought, as most all the operating systems that are built in Azure are built with the data center license. So you can see, as I use the hybrid benefit, it takes my OS cost to 0 and then changes my machine cost, there as well. The one thing that doesn't change doesn't fluctuate, is your disk. So even if you shut the machine down, this disk price will be the same, as it's going to keep the disk around. Only until you delete that disk will that cost not be there for virtual machines. Now we have about 5 minutes left, and I blew through a bunch of information, so I hope I didn't overwhelm anybody. Um, that's about it for what we have. And again, like we said, this is where I can share this link and send it to whoever the partners who asked, kind of, can you help me build out this demo, or to the end customer even, because this is MSRP. So I thank you for your guys' time today. If you have any questions or you'd like some more specific answers to some of those questions, reach out to your account managers. We're here to help. We want to help you build this Azure practice. We don't want this to be a scary tool. It can be overwhelming at first, but as you get used to it and as you start using it more and more and knowing what to kind of pick, we're here to help in that process. You'll get more comfortable with it, and you'll start growing your Azure business. And we thank you again today for your time.
Hey, TJ, there's a few questions in the chat. Do you mind looking some of those over?
Yeah, didn't. I just been blowing through here. So let's see.
No, you're fine.
What do we got? Okay, so on the, let's see, I think right now we can do US dollar. You can show in Canadian dollar here at the very bottom, right? So that's what Paul, I think you were asking, what kind of we can show Canadian dollars in the pricing calculator, and it shows what that conversion is currently. So that's one way of making, if you're a Canadian reseller. Let's see here. What else is share on a managed disk? So no, I mean, like if you have a managed disk, it's attached to a server, so it's going to be an SMB share. It's going to and it's going to perform as the SLAs for the disk that you attach to it, Joe. There's no difference there, other than just the performance on the back end and how you might. There's no difference in accessing it because it's an SMB. And Microsoft or Windows is kind of handling it exactly the way that you would anyway else. So the kind of answer around the file server deployment, there's a couple of different ways, right? So the Azure Files is one way that you can do that. So I've seen people, because they like a little bit more control and are used to doing the Microsoft file server, you can kind of do that as well and kind of keep that the same way that you've been doing it until you get a little bit more familiar with the Azure environment, and then maybe want to move to some of those platforms or those other services. This is a great way, like I like to say too, get everything into Azure, and then you can start using those other platform options that are available to you as well, and you can start branching out and leveraging some of the nice enterprise class stuff you have available in Azure. If the client's internet speed is 100 megs, does that mean we should stick with, yeah, I would stick with basic, because you're not going to get anything more out of it. The only difference is that if you want to do those point-to-site connections and you add a bunch of point-to-site connections, that's part of your aggregate. So just because their site may only have 100 meg, you may want to have more bandwidth available to you for those who maybe don't work in the office and are using that point-to-site connection as opposed to the site-to-site connection that you have. So what about 1 year or 3 year subscriptions for server for the hybrid benefit? Only standard is offered. So no, standard and data center both offer. server side. So it's not just standard. Standard gives you is limited to what you can do in Azure, where the data center license is bigger. Now, if you want to do a standard OS in Azure, you're going to have to build that image yourself and deploy that onto your machine versus using what's in the Azure marketplace because Azure marketplace images are all data center images. If that makes sense there, Jason. I think that's all of the questions. Only standard descriptions offered in Stellar. I don't know. You'd have to talk to your account rep. I'm sure that you can get data center licensing through Stellar. It just might be in a little bit of a different place, and or it might be bubbled up at the top because we get a lot of standard purchases. So I would talk with your account rep there, Jason. And with that, we kind of go back to this. And just like to say, thank you for joining us again today. I hope it's helpful. If it's not very clear or